Marcus Bennett stopped dead in his tracks, the bouquet of white lilies slipping from his fingers as he stared at his wife's grave. A massive gray wolf was frantically digging at Catherine's headstone, dirt flying in desperate arcs around the pristine marble. This wasn't vandalism. It was a rescue mission. The groundskeeper's rake clattered to the ground behind Marcus, his weathered face draining of color. "Sweet Jesus," Harold whispered, backing toward his truck. "That thing's bigger than any wolf I've ever seen." Marcus's chest tightened as memories flooded back. Catherine's final words about protecting the innocent, about never turning away from someone in need. The wolf's piercing blue eyes met his across the cemetery, filled with an intelligence that made Marcus's breath catch. "Easy, boy," Marcus called out, his veterinarian instincts overriding his shock. From beneath the earth came the sound that changed everything, tiny, desperate whimpers echoing from what appeared to be a collapsed den. How long had they been trapped down there? And why had this wolf chosen Catherine's grave as the place to make his stand? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. At 62, Marcus Bennett carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades understanding creatures that others feared. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Copper Falls Cemetery, nestled in the Montana wilderness where Catherine had chosen to rest. 3 years had passed since cancer claimed his wife of 34 years, and Marcus had maintained his monthly ritual of bringing her favorite white lilies with the devotion of a man still desperately in love. His weathered hands, scarred from years as a Marine veterinarian, trembled slightly as he approached the impossible scene before him. The wolf was magnificent, easily 120 pounds of raw muscle and intelligence, with a coat that shifted from silver to charcoal in the morning light, but it was those eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Blue as Montana sky, they held a depth of emotion that spoke of loss, desperation, and something Marcus recognized from his own mirror, the look of a soul fighting to save what remained of his world. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, treating military dogs and working with local wildlife when circumstances demanded. He'd seen apex predators in distress before, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The wolf's paws were bloody from digging, his magnificent coat matted with dirt and sweat. This wasn't the behavior of a rabid animal or territorial aggressor. This was pure parental desperation. "That's Ghost," Harold whispered from behind his truck, his voice barely audible. "Been hearing stories about him for months. Lost his whole pack to poachers last spring. Folks say he's been wandering alone ever since, crazy with grief." The name fit. Ghost moved with ethereal grace despite his obvious exhaustion, and those blue eyes seemed to see straight through to Marcus's soul. As if sensing the conversation, the wolf lifted his massive head and released a sound that made Marcus's chest tighten. Not a howl of aggression, but a whimper so human-like it bordered on heartbreaking. Marcus knelt slowly, his knees protesting against the cold ground. The sounds from beneath Catherine's grave were clearer now. Tiny voices crying for help, growing weaker by the minute. His veterinary training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The den had collapsed, likely trapping Ghost's remaining pups in an air pocket that wouldn't last much longer. "Catherine," Marcus whispered to the headstone, "I couldn't save you, but maybe." He looked at Ghost, who was watching him with an intensity that suggested the wolf understood every word. "Maybe this is why you chose her grave. You knew I'd come here. You knew I'd understand." Ghost approached cautiously, stopping just feet from Marcus. The wolf's breathing was labored, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. In that moment Marcus saw himself 3 years ago. A desperate soul refusing to give up on someone he loved, fighting against impossible odds to save what mattered most. "All right, boy," Marcus said softly, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's dig." The moment Marcus knelt beside Ghost and began digging, something extraordinary happened. The wolf's desperate energy shifted into focused determination, as if he finally had an ally who understood the stakes. Together, they worked in a rhythm that defied logic. Man and predator united by the universal language of parental love. Marcus's hands tore through the rocky Montana soil, his military training taking over as he assessed the structural integrity of the collapsed den. Ghost's powerful claws scraped against stone and root, both of them racing against time as the whimpering from below grew fainter. The wolf's intelligence was remarkable. He seemed to understand that Marcus needed space to work the technical aspects of the rescue while Ghost handled the heavy excavation. "Easy, babies," Marcus called down into the darkness, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We're coming for you." Ghost paused in his digging to look at Marcus, those piercing blue eyes holding what could only be described as gratitude. In that moment, Marcus realized this wasn't just about saving trapped animals. It was about two fathers who had lost everything, finding purpose in protecting the innocent. The den structure became clearer as they dug deeper. It had been expertly constructed, taking advantage of the cemetery's natural slope and the root system of an ancient pine tree. But something had caused a catastrophic collapse. The main entrance tunnel had caved in completely, creating a debris field that had nearly sealed the pup's chamber. Marcus's trained eye noted that the collapse pattern looked wrong, too uniform to be natural. "This wasn't an accident," Marcus muttered, examining the packed earth and scattered rocks. Someone had deliberately caused this cave-in, but who would go to such lengths to trap wolf pups? Ghost's ears flattened at Marcus's tone, and he let out a low growl that seemed to confirm the suspicion. After 45 minutes of back-breaking work, they broke through to the chamber. Marcus carefully cleared the opening while Ghost whined anxiously beside him. The space was smaller than Marcus had hoped, barely large enough for the adult wolves who had originally dug it. 4 tiny shapes huddled together in the far corner, their eyes not yet open, their bodies frighteningly still. Marcus's heart clenched as he reached for the first pup. It was barely bigger than his fist, its gray fur matted and cold. No movement, no response to his touch. He quickly checked for vital signs: a faint heartbeat, shallow breathing, hypothermia and dehydration, but alive. Ghost pressed close as Marcus examined each pup, the wolf's massive head hovering protectively over his babies. The second pup was in better condition, moving weakly when Marcus lifted it. The third showed signs of severe dehydration but was breathing steadily. It was the fourth pup, the smallest of the litter, that broke Marcus's heart. She lay motionless, her tiny body limp and unresponsive. Ghost immediately focused on this pup, nuzzling her gently with his enormous snout, whimpering in a way that transcended species barriers. "She's not gone," Marcus said firmly, cradling the lifeless form against his chest. "Not yet." He began gentle chest compressions, using techniques adapted from his work with military dogs. Ghost watched intently, occasionally touching his nose to the pup as if willing life back into her tiny body. As Marcus worked to revive the smallest pup, Ghost made a decision that would haunt Marcus forever in the most beautiful way possible. The wolf carefully picked up the other 3 pups in his massive jaws, so gently that Marcus marveled at the precision, and placed them directly at Marcus's feet. The gesture was unmistakable. "Take them. Save them. I trust you with everything I have left." "We need to get them warm immediately," Marcus said, bundling all 4 pups inside his jacket. Ghost's scent was still strong on them, a wild, earthy smell mixed with something that reminded Marcus of Catherine's garden after rain. The smallest pup stirred slightly against Marcus's chest, a tiny movement that sent hope surging through both rescuers. Marcus stood slowly, his back protesting after the extended digging session. Ghost remained close, his blue eyes never leaving the bundle of pups in Marcus's arms. The wolf was clearly exhausted, his powerful frame trembling with fatigue, but his focus never wavered from his babies. "My clinic is 15 minutes away," Marcus said, looking directly at Ghost. "They need medical attention now, but I can't force you to come with me. This has to be your choice." Ghost tilted his massive head, studying Marcus's face with an intensity that seemed to look straight into his soul. For a long moment the cemetery was silent except for the wind through the pines and the faint sounds of the pups beginning to stir. Then Ghost walked deliberately to Marcus's pickup truck and sat beside the passenger door, his meaning crystal clear. "All right then," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go save your children." The 15-minute drive to Marcus's property passed in tense silence, broken only by the soft whimpering of the pups and Ghost's heavy breathing from the passenger seat. Marcus had expected the wolf to be agitated in the confined space of the truck, but Ghost remained perfectly still, his intelligent blue eyes fixed on the bundle of his children cradled in Marcus's lap. Every few seconds, the wolf would extend his massive head to gently nuzzle one of the pups, as if reassuring himself they were still alive. Marcus's home clinic occupied a converted barn behind his modest ranch house, equipped with everything needed for emergency veterinary care. Catherine had helped him design the space during his transition from military service to civilian practice, her artistic eye softening the clinical efficiency with warm wood tones and natural light. As Marcus pulled into the gravel driveway, memories of her laughter echoing through these buildings threatened to overwhelm him. "Focus," he told himself, lifting the pups carefully from his lap. Ghost immediately leaped from the truck, positioning himself between Marcus and any potential threats as they approached the clinic entrance. The wolf's protective instincts were extraordinary. Even in his exhausted state, he maintained constant vigilance over his vulnerable offspring. Inside the clinic, Marcus quickly assessed his tiny patients under the bright examination lights. The largest pup, a male with Ghost's distinctive silver markings, showed signs of severe dehydration but responded well to gentle stimulation. The second pup, a female with darker coloring, was weak but breathing steadily. The third pup remained concerning, lethargic and unresponsive to most stimuli. It was the smallest pup that demanded immediate intervention. Her breathing was so shallow it was barely detectable, her tiny body cold and limp in Marcus's experienced hands. Ghost positioned himself directly beside the examination table, his massive head resting on his paws as he watched every movement with the intensity of a concerned parent in a hospital waiting room. "Come on, little one," Marcus whispered, as he prepared warming blankets and began establishing IV access through the pup's tiny leg. The procedure required microscopic precision. Wolf pup veins were barely visible, and one mistake could cause fatal complications. Ghost whined softly as the needle went in, but he never moved from his vigil position. Marcus worked with the methodical efficiency of his military training, setting up warming lamps, oxygen support, and carefully calculated fluid replacement therapy. The clinic filled with the quiet sounds of medical equipment humming to life, punctuated by Ghost's worried breathing and the occasional soft whimper from the pups. After 2 hours of intensive care, the 3 larger pups were stable and beginning to show signs of improvement. They moved more actively under the warming lights, their tiny mouths working instinctively as they sensed their father's presence nearby. Ghost's tail gave the faintest wag as he watched his children begin to recover, but his attention remained focused on the smallest pup, who had shown little improvement despite Marcus's efforts. "She's fighting, but she's so small," Marcus explained to Ghost, as if the wolf could understand every word. Remarkably, Ghost's behavior suggested he did understand. The wolf's ears perked up at Marcus's tone, and he moved closer to the examination table where the tiny female lay, surrounded by medical equipment. Marcus had seen this scenario countless times in his career. The runt of the litter, born smaller and weaker than her siblings, struggling to survive in a world that demanded strength. But there was something about this particular pup that reminded him of Catherine in her final days, a stubborn spark of life that refused to be extinguished even when the odds seemed impossible. Catherine always said the smallest flowers bloomed the brightest, Marcus said softly, gently stroking the pup's tiny head with one finger. Ghost seemed to understand the reverence in Marcus's voice, moving even closer until his massive snout was just inches from his daughter's still form. Then something miraculous happened. As Ghost's warm breath washed over the tiny pup, she stirred. It was barely perceptible. A slight movement of her head, a tiny squeak that was more felt than heard. But it was enough to electrify both Marcus and Ghost with hope. "That's it, sweetheart," Marcus encouraged, carefully adjusting the warming lamp and increasing the oxygen flow. "Your daddy's here. We're both here. And we're not giving up on you." Ghost's response was immediate and heartbreaking. The massive wolf gently extended one huge paw, placing it carefully beside his daughter's tiny form without touching her delicate medical equipment. He began a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something uniquely wolfish that seemed designed to comfort and encourage. Over the next hour, the smallest pup's condition gradually improved. Her breathing became more regular, her body temperature stabilized, and she began responding to gentle stimulation. Marcus monitored her progress with the intensity of a man who understood that sometimes the smallest victories carried the greatest meaning. As evening approached, all 4 pups were stable enough for Marcus to step back and truly appreciate what had happened. Ghost had never left his position beside the examination table, maintaining his vigil with the dedication of a parent who refused to lose another child. The wolf's trust in Marcus had been absolute, allowing a human stranger to handle his most precious possessions with invasive medical procedures that must have seemed terrifying to a wild animal. "You know," Marcus said to Ghost as they watched the pups sleep peacefully under the warming lights, "I haven't felt this useful in 3 years. Catherine would have loved seeing this. A father fighting for his children, never giving up no matter how impossible things seemed." Ghost lifted his magnificent head and looked directly at Marcus. Those piercing blue eyes, holding depths of intelligence and emotion that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about wild animals. In that moment, a bond formed between them that transcended species. 2 fathers who had lost their mates, now united in protecting what remained of their worlds. The smallest pup squeaked softly in her sleep, and both Marcus and Ghost turned their attention to her immediately, their newly formed partnership already operating with the seamless efficiency of a family that had always been together. The first week of caring for Ghost's pups established a routine that surprised Marcus with its natural rhythm. Each morning he would find Ghost waiting patiently outside the clinic door, having spent the night patrolling the property perimeter. The wolf's dedication was absolute. He never wandered far, never abandoned his post, and seemed to understand that his children needed the medical equipment Marcus provided while also requiring their father's constant presence. Marcus had converted a corner of the clinic into a makeshift nursery, complete with specialized heating pads, feeding equipment, and monitoring devices adapted for wolf physiology. Ghost observed every procedure with the intensity of a medical student, learning to recognize the sounds that meant his pups were thriving versus those that indicated distress. When Marcus needed to handle the pups for examinations or feeding, Ghost would position himself nearby, ready to intervene if necessary, but trusting enough to allow the process. The smallest pup, whom Marcus had begun calling Luna for her pale silver markings that seemed to glow under the clinic lights, required the most intensive care. She was barely half the size of her siblings and struggled with basic functions that came naturally to the others. Ghost seemed to understand her special needs, spending extra time grooming her and positioning himself as a living windbreak when she slept. "She's got your determination," Marcus told Ghost one morning, as Luna managed to nurse for longer than ever before. The wolf's tail gave a proud wag, and Marcus realized he was beginning to read Ghost's emotional expressions as clearly as he had Catherine's subtle moods. The parallels between his lost wife and this remarkable wolf were striking. Both possessed an inner strength that manifested as gentle persistence rather than aggressive force. By the second week, the three larger pups had grown noticeably stronger and more active. They had begun opening their eyes, revealing the same piercing blue that made Ghost so distinctive. Marcus discovered this was extremely rare in wild wolves, suggesting Ghost came from a unique genetic lineage. The pups' playful wrestling and squeaking filled the clinic with sounds of life that Marcus hadn't heard in his home since Catherine's illness had silenced her laughter. Ghost's intelligence continued to astound Marcus daily. The wolf learned to operate the simple latch on the clinic door, understanding that gentle pressure rather than force was required. He began bringing Marcus offerings, fresh fish from the stream that ran through the property, wild berries, and on one memorable morning, a bouquet of wildflowers that he laid carefully at the clinic entrance. Marcus recognized Catherine's favorite mountain lupines among the flowers and felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. "You've been watching me at the cemetery," Marcus said to Ghost that evening. "You know about Catherine, don't you?" Ghost's response was to approach slowly and rest his massive head against Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that spoke volumes about the depth of understanding between them. The community's reaction to Marcus's unusual house guests varied dramatically. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the local veterinarian who had been Marcus's colleague for years, visited regularly to assist with the pup's care and marveled at Ghost's behavior. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, watching Ghost gently nudge Luna toward her feeding bottle. "His protective instincts are perfectly calibrated, vigilant but not aggressive, devoted but not possessive. He's allowing you to be a co-parent." However, not everyone in Copper Falls viewed the arrangement positively. Sheriff Tom Bradley visited twice during the second week, responding to complaints from nervous residents who had heard about the dangerous predator living on Marcus's property. Ghost's reaction to uniformed officials was telling. He became instantly alert and positioned himself between any stranger and his pups, but never showed aggression unless directly threatened. "Marcus, I know you're doing good work here," Sheriff Bradley said during his second visit, watching Ghost maintain perfect discipline despite obvious stress. "But folks are worried. Wolves killed 3 head of cattle on the Morrison Ranch last week, and people are connecting dots that might not be there." "This wolf hasn't left my property," Marcus replied firmly. "He's been with me or within sight 24 hours a day. If Morrison's having predator problems, they're not coming from Ghost." The sheriff nodded, but Marcus caught the concern in his old friend's eyes. "Just be careful, Marcus. Clayton Morrison's got influence in this county, and he's pushing hard for predator control measures. He's claiming significant livestock losses and property damage." That evening, Marcus researched Clayton Morrison more thoroughly than he had when the man first approached him about selling his property 6 months earlier. Morrison Development had purchased several large parcels around Copper Falls, always after the previous owners experienced mysterious problems that made their land less viable. Livestock deaths, property damage, equipment failures, all occurring just before Morrison made generous offers to help struggling landowners. Ghost's behavior during the sheriff's visits had been telling in another way. The wolf clearly distinguished between people based on their intentions rather than their uniforms or authority. He remained calm around Dr. Hayes and her veterinary students, but became agitated whenever anyone associated with Morrison appeared in the area. By the third week, Luna had begun showing remarkable progress. She was still smaller than her siblings, but her personality was emerging as bold and curious rather than fragile. She seemed particularly drawn to Marcus, often choosing to sleep against his leg rather than with her litter mates. Ghost observed this bonding with what appeared to be approval, occasionally nudging Luna toward Marcus when she seemed distressed. "She's imprinted on you," Dr. Hayes observed during one of her visits. "It's not uncommon with hand-raised wolves, but Ghost's acceptance of it is extraordinary." Most wild parents would be territorial about such exclusive bonding. Marcus found himself thinking about Catherine's final weeks, when she had spoken about legacy and continuing bonds. "Love doesn't end when someone dies," she had told him. "It just changes form, finds new ways to express itself." Watching Ghost trust him with Luna's specialized care felt like Catherine's words taking physical shape. The fourth week brought unexpected challenges. Luna had grown strong enough to attempt following her siblings in their increasingly adventurous explorations of the clinic, but her smaller size made her vulnerable to injuries that wouldn't affect the others. Ghost began spending more time inside the clinic, positioning himself as a living barrier between Luna and potential hazards. Marcus installed child gates and padding to create safer play areas, marveling at how naturally he had fallen into the role of protective parent. Ghost's approval of these modifications was evident in his relaxed posture, and the way he began bringing his hunting trophies directly to Marcus rather than leaving them at the clinic entrance. "You're teaching her to trust humans," Marcus realized one afternoon as Luna confidently approached him for attention while her siblings remained more cautious. "You're preparing her for a different kind of life." Ghost's response was to gently take Luna in his mouth and place her directly in Marcus's lap. The message was unmistakable. This pup belonged to both of them now, bridging the gap between wild and domestic through the bond they had forged in crisis. Dr. Hayes documented Ghost's behavior extensively, recognizing its potential significance for wildlife management and human-animal relationships. "He's demonstrating cognitive abilities that challenge our understanding of wolf intelligence," she explained to Marcus. "The way he's adapted to your medical routines, learned to use your equipment, and integrated human caregiving with natural wolf parenting, it suggests a level of reasoning we typically associate with much more developed brains." The implications were staggering. If Ghost represented a subspecies with enhanced cognitive abilities, his pups might carry those same traits. Luna's unusual bonding patterns and quick learning could be evidence of inherited intelligence rather than simple imprinting. As the fourth week drew to a close, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Clayton Morrison arrived unannounced, driving an expensive SUV and accompanied by two men Marcus didn't recognize. Ghost's reaction was immediate and alarming. The wolf's hackles rose, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and he positioned himself directly between Morrison and the clinic entrance. "Impressive animal," Morrison said, his tone casual but his eyes calculating. "Must be worth quite a bit to the right buyer. I know people who collect exotic predators." "He's not for sale," Marcus replied, noting how Ghost's agitation increased at Morrison's voice. The wolf's body language suggested recognition rather than simple territorial response, as if he had encountered Morrison before. "Everything's for sale at the right price, Marcus. You're getting older. This property's becoming too much for you to handle alone. My offer still stands, generous compensation for you, and I'll even arrange proper placement for your wolf friend here." Marcus studied Morrison's face, seeing calculation behind the friendly mask. "What kind of placement?" "Private game preserve. Wealthy clients who appreciate rare specimens. He'd be well cared for, and you'd never have to worry about government interference or liability issues. Ghost's growl was barely audible but unmistakable. Morrison's men shifted nervously, hands moving toward concealed weapons. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with the promise of violence. "I think you should leave," Marcus said quietly. "Now." Morrison's friendly facade slipped entirely. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. Wolves are dangerous, unpredictable. Accidents happen. Insurance companies don't pay out for exotic animal attacks, and the state has very clear policies about predator control." As Morrison's SUV disappeared down the gravel drive, Ghost remained alert and agitated for hours. Marcus found himself checking and rechecking the clinic's security systems, unable to shake the feeling that Morrison's visit had been more threat than offer. That night, as Marcus sat with Luna sleeping in his lap while Ghost maintained watch at the window, he realized their peaceful interlude was ending. Morrison's interest in the property, combined with his obvious recognition by Ghost, suggested a connection that went deeper than simple real estate development. "What did he do to your family?" Marcus asked Ghost softly. The wolf's blue eyes met his in the lamplight, holding depths of pain and memory that made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. Whatever Morrison had done, Ghost remembered, and the wolf's trust in Marcus had become their only protection against a threat that was growing more dangerous by the day. The confrontation Marcus had been dreading arrived on a cold Thursday morning in the form of 3 black SUVs rolling up his gravel driveway. Clayton Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle accompanied by 4 men wearing official-looking uniforms and carrying tranquilizer guns. Ghost's reaction was immediate and violent. The wolf's entire body went rigid, his lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed gleaming fangs, and a growl rumbled from his chest that seemed to shake the clinic walls. "Marcus Bennett," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the false authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "We're here on official business. I'm accompanied by state wildlife officers who have authorization to remove the dangerous predator you've been harboring illegally." Marcus stepped onto his porch, positioning himself between the armed men and his clinic. Ghost moved to his side, the wolf's massive frame coiled with barely contained aggression. Luna and her siblings were inside the clinic, vulnerable and dependent on the 2 fathers who had sworn to protect them. "Let me see your credentials," Marcus demanded, his military training kicking in as he assessed the tactical situation. 4 armed men against 1 aging veteran and a wolf, with innocent pups in the crossfire. The odds were terrible, but Marcus had faced worse in Afghanistan. The lead officer stepped forward, badge gleaming in the morning sun. "Agent Thompson, Montana Wildlife Services. We've received multiple reports of livestock predation and property damage linked to this animal. State regulations require immediate removal and assessment." Ghost's growl intensified, and his body language made Marcus's blood run cold. This wasn't the reaction of a wolf seeing strangers. This was recognition, hatred, and fear combined into barely controlled fury. Ghost knew these men, and his response suggested their previous encounter had ended in tragedy. "Interesting reaction," Morrison observed, his tone casual but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Almost like he remembers us from somewhere. Wolves have excellent memories, don't they, Marcus?" The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't just been pressuring Marcus to sell his property. He had been systematically eliminating the wildlife that made development difficult. Ghost's pack hadn't been killed by random poachers, they had been murdered by Morrison's hired guns wearing fake Wildlife Service uniforms. "You son of a bitch," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a man pushed beyond his limits. "You killed his family." Morrison's mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Wolves are a natural obstacle to development. Sometimes obstacles need to be removed for the greater good. That pack was costing me hundreds of thousands in delays and environmental impact studies. Ghost's snarl became audible now, a sound that made Morrison's men shift nervously and raise their weapons. The wolf was no longer just protecting his pups. He was facing the monsters who had destroyed everything he had loved before Marcus gave him a reason to hope again. "Stand down, Marcus," the fake Agent Thompson ordered. "This animal is clearly aggressive and poses an immediate threat to public safety. We're authorized to use lethal force if necessary." "Like hell you are," Marcus replied, reaching slowly for the shotgun he kept mounted inside his front door. "This is my property, those are fake badges, and you're trespassing with illegal weapons." The standoff stretched taut as both sides calculated their chances. Morrison's men had superior firepower, but they were in the open while Marcus had cover and high ground. Ghost represented an unknown variable. His size and intelligence made him unpredictable in a firefight, and his emotional state suggested he would fight to the death to protect his remaining family. "Let's be reasonable," Morrison said, raising his hands in a gesture of false peace. "I'm willing to make this worth your while, Marcus. $1 million for the property, cash, and I'll ensure the wolf gets placed in a proper facility instead of being destroyed." "What kind of facility?" Marcus demanded, though he already suspected the answer. "Private collectors pay premium prices for exotic predators, especially ones with unusual characteristics like those blue eyes. He'd live comfortably, and his offspring would be valuable breeding stock." The horror of Morrison's plan hit Marcus like a physical blow. Ghost and his pups weren't just obstacles to be removed, they were commodities to be harvested and sold to wealthy sadists who collected dangerous animals as trophies. Morrison had probably been planning this from the moment he learned about Ghost's unique genetics. Ghost seemed to understand the threat even without comprehending the words. His protective positioning intensified, and he began making a sound Marcus had never heard before. A low, rhythmic call that seemed to carry for miles across the Montana wilderness. "He's calling for help," Marcus realized with growing dread. "Ghost, no, there's no one left to answer." But Ghost continued his haunting call, and Morrison's men grew increasingly agitated. They had come expecting to deal with one isolated wolf and an old man, not a highly intelligent predator who might have backup strategies they hadn't anticipated. "Enough of this bullshit," Morrison snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Thompson, tranquilize the animal. If the old man interferes, consider him a threat to officer safety." The fake agent raised his tranquilizer gun, aiming directly at Ghost's chest. The wolf stood his ground, blue eyes blazing with defiance, ready to die protecting his children, just as he had undoubtedly watched his mate die protecting them months earlier. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reaching for his shotgun, he stepped directly between the gun and Ghost, using his own body as a shield. "You want him? You go through me first," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "I'm a decorated Marine veteran, and I'm not going to let you murder another innocent family." Morrison's face contorted with rage. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Bennett. I own half the county officials, and the other half owe me favors. No one's going to believe your story about fake wildlife officers and illegal predator control." "Maybe not," Marcus replied, "but I've got 20 years of veterinary records documenting Ghost's behavior, medical examinations proving he's never been aggressive, and security cameras recording everything that's happening right now." The lie about security cameras struck home. Morrison's eyes darted nervously around the property, looking for equipment that didn't exist. But his moment of uncertainty gave Marcus the opening he needed. "Ghost," Marcus said softly, never taking his eyes off Morrison's men. "Take the pups and run. Get them to safety. I'll hold them here as long as I can." The wolf's intelligence shone through in that moment. Ghost understood that Marcus was offering to sacrifice himself, just as Ghost had been prepared to do. The bond between them had evolved beyond species barriers into something pure and unbreakable. Two fathers willing to die for their children. But Ghost made a different choice. Instead of fleeing, he moved closer to Marcus, pressing his massive shoulder against the old man's leg in a gesture of solidarity. They would face this threat together, as partners, as family. Morrison's patience finally snapped completely. "Kill them both," he ordered. The wolf was aggressive, the old man was armed and threatening. Self-defense. Clean it up and burn the buildings. Thompson's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. Real law enforcement was coming, responding to something Morrison hadn't anticipated. "Boss," one of Morrison's men said urgently, "we need to go. Now." Morrison's face went white as he realized his carefully planned operation was falling apart. "This isn't over, Bennett. You have no idea who you're fucking with." "Actually, I do," Marcus replied, his voice carrying new confidence. "You're a small-time crook who's been murdering wildlife to inflate property values, and your time just ran out." The sirens grew louder, and Morrison's men were already retreating toward their vehicles. But Morrison himself seemed frozen by rage and disbelief, unable to accept that his intimidation tactics had failed. Ghost sensed the shift in momentum and moved forward, no longer defensive but assertive. His blue eyes locked onto Morrison's, and the sound that emerged from the wolf's throat was no longer a growl of fear. It was the hunting call of an apex predator who had found his prey. Morrison stumbled backward, finally understanding that he was no longer the predator in this scenario. He had become the hunted, and Ghost's memory was very long indeed. As the first police cruiser crested the hill, Morrison made a desperate choice. Instead of fleeing with his men, he pulled a concealed pistol and aimed it directly at Ghost's head. "If I can't have what I want," Morrison snarled, "then no one can." The gunshot echoed across the Montana wilderness, and Marcus watched in horror as everything he had fought to protect seemed to collapse in a single devastating moment. The gunshot shattered the morning air like breaking glass, and Marcus felt his world collapse in the space of a heartbeat. But it wasn't Ghost who fell. It was Luna, the smallest pup, who had somehow escaped from the clinic and was running toward her father when Morrison's bullet found her tiny body instead. The little wolf pup tumbled across the gravel, her pale silver fur instantly stained with crimson. Ghost's howl of anguish rose from somewhere so deep in his soul that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Marcus had heard wounded animals cry before, but nothing had prepared him for the sound of a father watching his child die. "No!" Marcus screamed, diving toward Luna's motionless form. The pup's eyes were open but glazing over, her breathing shallow and erratic. Blood seeped from a wound in her chest, and Marcus's veterinary training told him immediately that the damage was catastrophic. Even with a fully equipped surgical suite, her chances would be minimal. Ghost reached his daughter first, his massive head lowering to gently nuzzle her broken body. The wolf's keen intelligence made his grief even more devastating. He understood exactly what had happened, exactly what he was losing. His blue eyes met Marcus's across Luna's still form, and in that moment both fathers shared a pain that transcended species. Morrison stood frozen, his smoking pistol still raised, his face a mask of shock and growing horror. He had intended to kill Ghost, to eliminate the witness to his crimes, but fate had intervened in the cruelest possible way. Instead of silencing his enemy, he had murdered an innocent child in front of her father. "What have you done?" Marcus whispered, cradling Luna's tiny body against his chest. Her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing second, and he could feel her small heart struggling against the massive trauma. She was just a baby. She was just trying to reach her father. The approaching sirens were louder now, and Morrison's men were shouting for him to run, but he seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had done. Even his cold calculation couldn't rationalize the murder of a wolf pup as anything other than senseless cruelty. Ghost's grief transformed into something Marcus had never witnessed before: pure, focused hatred. The wolf's massive frame seemed to grow larger as his hackles rose, his lips pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers. But instead of attacking Morrison immediately, Ghost did something that made Marcus's blood run cold with understanding. The wolf began to sing. It started as a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo from every corner of the Montana wilderness. Within moments, other voices joined the lament, distant at first, then growing closer. Ghost's call from earlier hadn't been a desperate plea for help that would never come. It had been a summons, and now his extended family was answering. "Jesus Christ," one of Morrison's men breathed, his face going white as he recognized the sound. "Boss, we need to leave. Now. There's a whole pack coming." But Morrison seemed trapped by his own guilt and Ghost's unwavering stare. The wolf's blue eyes held him like a physical force, promising retribution that would be swift and merciless. Morrison raised his pistol again, his hand shaking with either fear or adrenaline. "I'll kill you all," Morrison snarled, his voice breaking with panic. "Every last one of you monsters." Marcus looked down at Luna's failing form and felt something inside himself break apart. This tiny creature had trusted him completely, had chosen him as her second father, had bonded with him in ways that transcended the natural order. And now she was dying because of human greed and cruelty. "You already have," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone present freeze. "You've killed the best part of all of us." Luna's breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge the passing of an innocent soul. Ghost's howl died in his throat, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse: the quiet whimpering of a parent who had lost everything he had fought to save. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he held Luna's still body. In 3 years of grieving Catherine, he had never cried this hard, never felt loss cut this deep. This tiny wolf had represented hope, renewal, the possibility that love could triumph over tragedy. Now she was gone, and the darkness seemed absolute. Morrison's fake wildlife officers were already fleeing, their vehicles disappearing in clouds of dust down the mountain road. But Morrison himself remained frozen, staring at the scene he had created with growing horror. The approaching howls were getting closer, and real police sirens mixed with the wild symphony of Ghost's family responding to his call for justice. "They're coming for you," Marcus told Morrison, his voice empty of emotion. "Ghost's pack isn't extinct. They scattered when you killed his mate, but they never left the territory. They've been watching, waiting, and now they know what you've done." Morrison's pistol wavered as the first shapes appeared at the tree line, gray shadows moving with deadly purpose through the Montana wilderness. Ghost's call had brought them home, and their alpha's grief had become their battle cry. Sheriff Bradley's cruiser crested the hill just as the first adult wolf emerged fully from the forest. The sheriff took one look at the scene: Marcus cradling a dead pup, Ghost mourning beside them, Morrison with a smoking gun, and a pack of wild wolves surrounding the property, and immediately radioed for backup. "Clayton Morrison, drop your weapon and step away from those men," Sheriff Bradley commanded, his own service pistol drawn but pointed at the ground. He was vastly outnumbered and outgunned by both human criminals and wild predators, but his voice carried the authority of justice finally arriving. Morrison spun toward the sheriff, his eyes wild with panic. "They're dangerous animals. I'm protecting the community. You have to kill them all." "The only dangerous animal I see here is you," Sheriff Bradley replied, his voice steady despite the surreal circumstances. "Now drop the gun before this gets any worse." Ghost lifted his massive head from Luna's body and looked directly at Morrison. The wolf's intelligence was terrifying in that moment. His blue eyes held not just animal instinct, but something approaching human understanding of justice and retribution. He seemed to be calculating, planning, waiting for the right moment to exact his revenge. The pack had formed a loose circle around the property now, 8 adult wolves moving with coordinated precision. They weren't attacking yet, but their message was clear. Morrison had nowhere to run, and the law of the wilderness was about to be enforced. "You don't understand," Morrison pleaded with the sheriff, his voice breaking with hysteria. "I own this county. I have contracts, investments, development rights. These animals are worth millions to the right buyers." "What you have," Sheriff Bradley said grimly, "is a dead wolf pup, multiple weapons violations, trespassing charges, and what appears to be conspiracy to commit fraud. Plus whatever other crimes we're going to uncover when we dig into your operation." Marcus stood slowly, Luna's body still cradled in his arms. Ghost moved to his side, the wolf's grief temporarily overshadowed by protective instincts. Even in his darkest moment, Ghost's priority remained the safety of his remaining children and his human partner. "She chose me," Marcus said to the sheriff, his voice hollow with loss. "Luna bonded with me like I was her father. Ghost trusted me to protect her, and I failed." "No," Sheriff Bradley said firmly. "Morrison failed. He's the one who brought violence to your sanctuary, who murdered an innocent animal for profit. This isn't on you, Marcus." Morrison made one final, desperate play. Instead of surrendering, he swung his pistol toward the clinic where Luna's 3 siblings were still hidden. If he couldn't have what he wanted, he would destroy everything Ghost and Marcus had built together. But Ghost had been waiting for exactly this moment. The wolf moved with liquid speed, his massive frame covering the distance to Morrison in a single bound. The developer's scream echoed across the wilderness as 130 pounds of grief-maddened predator brought him to the ground. The sound of Morrison's gun firing one last time mixed with Ghost's roar of vengeance, and Marcus closed his eyes, unable to watch the final act of a tragedy that had cost them everything they had fought to save. The gunshot that Marcus expected to end Ghost's life never came. Instead, Sheriff Bradley's service weapon barked twice in rapid succession, and Morrison's final shot went wild, his aim destroyed by the sheriff's precise marksmanship. Morrison collapsed to the gravel, clutching his shoulder, his weapon skittering away across the driveway. Ghost stood over the wounded developer, his massive jaws just inches from Morrison's throat. But the wolf's remarkable intelligence held him back from delivering the killing blow. Instead, Ghost's blue eyes met Sheriff Bradley's across the chaos, and some wordless communication passed between them. A recognition that justice would be served, but through the law rather than ancient predator codes. "Stand down, Ghost," Marcus said softly, still cradling Luna's lifeless body. The wolf immediately obeyed, stepping back from Morrison but maintaining his threatening posture. The pack at the tree line held their positions, waiting for their alpha's signal, their yellow eyes gleaming with barely contained fury. Dr. Jennifer Hayes arrived in her veterinary van just as the state police backup vehicles crested the hill, their sirens adding to the chaos. She took one look at Luna's still form in Marcus's arms and immediately understood the tragedy that had unfolded. "Marcus?" she said gently, approaching slowly so as not to agitate Ghost or his pack. "Let me examine her. Sometimes what looks fatal isn't always—" "She's gone, Jen," Marcus interrupted, his voice hollow with grief. "Morrison's bullet caught her in the chest. I felt her heart stop." But Dr. Hayes persisted, her professional instincts overriding the emotional weight of the moment. Please, Marcus, let me try. Sometimes trauma can cause temporary cardiac arrest, especially in young animals. If there's even a chance, Ghost seemed to understand the veterinarian's intent. He moved closer to Marcus and gently nuzzled Luna's still form, then looked up at Dr. Hayes with an expression that clearly communicated permission. Even in his grief, the wolf father was willing to grasp at any hope, no matter how slim. Marcus reluctantly transferred Luna's tiny body to Dr. Hayes's capable hands. She immediately began emergency resuscitation procedures, checking for vital signs that Marcus's overwhelming grief might have missed. Ghost watched every movement with laser focus, his massive head following the veterinarian's hands as she worked. "There," Dr. Hayes whispered, her fingers pressed against Luna's chest. "I've got a heartbeat. It's weak and irregular, but it's there. Marcus, she's alive." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had been so certain, so devastated by what he thought was Luna's death, that the possibility of survival seemed impossible. Ghost's reaction was immediate. The wolf's entire body language shifted from mourning to desperate hope, his tail giving the faintest wag as he processed the news. The bullet passed through her shoulder, missing the vital organs. Dr. Hayes continued, working rapidly to stabilize the tiny patient. "She's lost blood and she's in shock, but if we can get her to the clinic immediately, she has a fighting chance." Ghost began making soft whining sounds, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to assist with medical procedures. Marcus found his voice again, croaky with emotion but carrying new determination. "What do you need?" he asked Dr. Hayes, his veterinary training reasserting itself as hope replaced despair. "Your clinic, full surgical setup, and about 6 hours of uninterrupted work," she replied, carefully lifting Luna in a heated blanket. "Ghost is going to need to trust us completely. This will require procedures that might look frightening to a protective parent." As they moved toward the clinic, the remarkable scene around them continued to unfold. Sheriff Bradley had Morrison in custody, but the developer was screaming about lawsuits, connections, and the impossibility of his situation. The wild pack maintained their positions, neither advancing nor retreating, as if waiting for Ghost's decision about their next move. "Bradley," Marcus called to the sheriff, "Morrison's been running an illegal wildlife elimination operation. Ghost's original pack, the livestock killings he's been reporting, it's all been fabricated to justify his predator control program." "We'll investigate everything," Sheriff Bradley assured him, "but right now I need to know about these wolves. Are they dangerous to my officers?" Ghost looked at Marcus, then at his pack, then back at the sheriff. In a display of intelligence that left everyone present speechless, the wolf moved to the center of the driveway and released a series of barks and low howls. The pack immediately began withdrawing into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had appeared. "He dismissed them," Marcus said in amazement. "Ghost sent his pack away to avoid escalating the situation." Inside the clinic, Dr. Hayes worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon fighting to save a life. Ghost positioned himself where he could observe the procedures without interfering, his blue eyes never leaving Luna's still form on the examination table. Marcus assisted with the precision of his military medical training, but his hands shook with residual adrenaline and overwhelming relief that Luna was alive. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Hayes had to repair damage to Luna's shoulder muscle, address internal bleeding, and stabilize her cardiovascular system. Throughout the entire procedure, Ghost maintained his vigil, occasionally making soft sounds of encouragement as if willing his daughter to fight for survival. "She's stable," Dr. Hayes finally announced, stepping back from the table with exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but she should make a full recovery. She might have a slight limp, but that shouldn't affect her quality of life significantly." Ghost's relief was palpable. The massive wolf approached the examination table cautiously, then gently nuzzled Luna's bandaged form. The pup stirred slightly at her father's touch, letting out a tiny squeak that brought tears to Marcus's eyes. While Luna recovered, the investigation into Morrison's crimes unfolded with shocking revelations. Sheriff Bradley's team discovered falsified Wildlife Service credentials, illegal weapons, and evidence of a systematic predator elimination program that had been operating across 3 counties. Morrison's development company had been purchasing land at artificially low prices after his hired gunmen eliminated the wildlife that made development complicated. Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a genuine wildlife biologist from the Blackfeet Nation, arrived the next day to assess Ghost and document his remarkable behavior. Her expertise in wolf genetics revealed that Ghost belonged to a subspecies thought to be extinct, the last known survivor of a lineage that possessed extraordinary intelligence and the rare blue-eye gene. This wolf represents genetic diversity that could be crucial for species recovery, Dr. Whitehorse explained to Marcus as they watched Ghost interact with his recovering daughter. His intelligence, his ability to cooperate with humans, his pack leadership skills, these traits could help bridge the gap between wild wolves and human communities. Morrison's arrest had triggered a federal investigation into wildlife crimes that stretched back 5 years. Evidence emerged of a network of corrupt officials, fake wildlife services, and systematic ecosystem destruction for profit. Morrison's empire, built on the graves of countless animals, was crumbling as the truth emerged. "The irony is perfect," Sheriff Bradley told Marcus during one of his visits to check on Luna's progress. Morrison thought he was eliminating obstacles to development. Instead, he created the evidence that's going to put him away for the rest of his life. Ghost's pack began returning gradually, establishing territories that overlapped with Marcus's property, but respecting the boundaries he set around the clinic. The wolves seemed to understand that this was neutral ground, a place where their alpha's human partner provided medical care and sanctuary. Luna's recovery became a daily miracle. Her tiny body responded to treatment with the resilience of youth, and her bond with Marcus grew stronger during the long hours of rehabilitation. Ghost encouraged this relationship, often nudging Luna toward Marcus when she seemed distressed or bringing her to him for comfort. "She's going to be different from her siblings," Dr. Whitehorse observed as Luna played with toys that Marcus had provided, a behavior unusual in wild wolves. The trauma bonding, combined with her extended exposure to human care, has created a unique psychological profile. She's truly a bridge between species. 3 weeks after the shooting, Luna took her first tentative steps on her healing leg. Ghost watched with obvious pride as his smallest daughter demonstrated the determination that had helped her survive the collapsed den, the intensive medical care, and now her recovery from a gunshot wound. Marcus found himself thinking about Catherine's words regarding love changing form rather than ending. Luna's survival felt like vindication of that philosophy. Love had triumphed over violence. Hope had overcome despair, and the bonds between species had proven stronger than human greed and cruelty. The legal proceedings against Morrison revealed the full scope of his crimes. 17 documented wildlife massacres, fraudulent land deals totaling over $10 million, corruption of public officials, and the systematic destruction of protected ecosystems. Morrison would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, his development empire dissolved and his assets seized to fund wildlife restoration. But for Marcus, the real victory was simpler and more profound. Each morning he would find Ghost waiting patiently outside the clinic, ready to begin another day of collaborative parenting. Luna would greet him with enthusiasm that bridged wild and domestic behaviors, her tail wagging while she maintained the alert posture of her wolf heritage. The truth had emerged from the darkest moment, not just the legal truth about Morrison's crimes, but the deeper truth about connection, loyalty, and the power of love to transcend every boundary that society had constructed between species, between wild and civilized, between ending and beginning. 1 year after that fateful morning at Catherine's grave, Marcus stood in the same spot with an entirely different perspective on life, death, and the miraculous ways that endings can become beginnings. The cemetery was bathed in the golden light of autumn, and the headstone that had once marked only loss now served as the cornerstone of something beautiful and unprecedented. Ghost lay beside Catherine's grave with the dignified posture of a patriarch watching over his extended family. Luna, now fully grown but still smaller than her siblings, pressed against Marcus's leg with the easy affection of a daughter who had never doubted her place in his heart. Her slight limp from Morrison's bullet had become barely noticeable, and the scar on her shoulder served as a reminder of how close they had all come to losing everything. The 3 other pups, now young adults, maintained respectful distance while still clearly being part of the family unit. They had grown into magnificent wolves, their blue eyes marking them as Ghost's children, and their confident bearing reflecting the security of having been raised in a sanctuary where humans and wolves coexisted as equals. "Catherine," Marcus said softly, placing fresh wildflowers at the base of her headstone, "I finally understand what you meant about love changing form. You brought me here that morning because you knew Ghost needed me, and I needed him. You orchestrated the most important meeting of my life." Dr. Sarah Whitehorse had documented their story extensively, and the Marcus Bennett Wildlife Sanctuary had become a model for human-wolf coexistence studied by researchers from around the world. The property had expanded to encompass nearly 1,000 acres, funded by donations that poured in after Ghost's story gained national attention. Ghost's pack had grown to include wolves from other displaced families, creating a unique social structure that bridged wild and domestic behaviors. The wolves hunted naturally in the vast preserve, but also understood that the clinic area was neutral ground where injured animals of all species received care without fear of predation. Luna had become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, greeting visitors with the kind of trust that challenged every preconception about wild animals. She could open simple latches, understood basic human gestures, and seemed to possess an intuitive ability to comfort traumatized animals brought to the sanctuary. "She's teaching other wolves to trust humans," Dr. Whitehorse had observed during her latest visit. Luna's behavior is being mimicked by younger pack members, creating a cultural shift that could revolutionize wildlife management. The legal aftermath of Morrison's crimes had continued to unfold throughout the year. Federal investigators had uncovered a network of corruption that reached into state wildlife agencies, local government, and private development companies. Morrison himself had been sentenced to life in prison, but his arrest had triggered reforms that protected thousands of acres of wilderness across the American West. Sheriff Bradley visited regularly, bringing his grandchildren to see the wolves and marveling at how Ghost's intelligence had essentially solved a criminal case that might otherwise have gone undetected for years. "That wolf has better investigative instincts than half my deputies," Bradley often joked, watching Ghost demonstrate problem-solving abilities that continued to astound researchers. Marcus had found his purpose in ways he never could have imagined during those dark months after Catherine's death. Each morning brought new challenges: injured wildlife, research projects, educational programs, and the complex logistics of managing a preserve where wild predators lived safely alongside human activities. The sanctuary employed a dozen staff members, including veterinarians, wildlife biologists, and education specialists. Dr. Jennifer Hayes had relocated her practice to the property, establishing a state-of-the-art veterinary facility that served both domestic and wild animals throughout the region. But the heart of the operation remained the relationship between Marcus and Ghost, two fathers who had found each other in their darkest moment and created something beautiful from shared loss and mutual trust. Ghost's intelligence continued to evolve in ways that challenged scientific understanding of wolf cognition. He had learned to operate basic tools, understood complex cause and effect relationships, and demonstrated emotional intelligence that seemed almost human in its sophistication. "He's not just intelligent," Dr. Whitehorse explained to a group of visiting researchers. "He's emotionally intelligent. Ghost can read human body language, respond to verbal cues, and make decisions based on empathy rather than just instinct." The pack's social structure had adapted to include Marcus as a permanent member, not as an alpha, but as a trusted elder whose judgment was respected by all pack members. When conflicts arose between wolves, they often sought Marcus's intervention, as if recognizing his role as a neutral arbitrator. Luna's unique position as a bridge between species had attracted attention from wildlife behaviorists studying the evolution of domestic animals. Her ability to switch between wild wolf behaviors and human socialized responses suggested possibilities for coexistence that previous research had deemed impossible. "She's creating a new category," one researcher noted. "Not wild, not domestic, but something entirely unique. A wolf who chooses to live between worlds and thrives there." The anniversary of Luna's near-death had become a celebration rather than a memorial. Each year on that date, the sanctuary hosted an open house where visitors could learn about wolf behavior, conservation efforts, and the remarkable story of how human compassion and animal intelligence had created something unprecedented. This year's celebration had drawn over 500 visitors, including former skeptics who had opposed the sanctuary's establishment, but now served as vocal advocates for wildlife conservation. As the sun set behind the Montana mountains, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Catherine's grave no longer represented an ending. It had become the birthplace of a new kind of family, a new understanding of what love could accomplish when it transcended species barriers. Ghost lifted his massive head and looked directly at Marcus, those piercing blue eyes holding depths of understanding that still amazed Marcus after a year of daily interaction. The wolf's expression seemed to say what Marcus felt in his heart. They had built something together that neither could have achieved alone. Luna stirred against Marcus's leg, then trotted over to Catherine's headstone and lay down beside it, as she did every evening. The other wolves settled into their familiar positions around the grave, creating a living memorial that honored both the human love that had brought them together and the wild spirit that kept them true to their nature. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to Catherine's memory, to Ghost's unwavering loyalty, to Luna's trust, and to the forces of fate that had brought them all together in this sacred place where love had indeed found new forms. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, the sound of wolves singing their evening songs echoed across the preserve. But these weren't the howls of wild predators claiming territory. They were the voices of family, celebrating another day of safety, abundance, and the miracle of trust between species. Marcus remained by Catherine's grave until the last notes of the wolf song faded into the Montana night, surrounded by the family he never could have imagined but couldn't now imagine living without. Love had changed form, just as Catherine promised, transforming grief into purpose, loss into gain, and ending into the most beautiful beginning any of them could have hoped for. The grave that had once marked death now anchored life, and the flowers placed there each month bloomed not just in memory of what was lost, but in celebration of everything that had been found. For those of us who have walked through the valley of loss, who have stood at gravesides wondering if love truly ends with death, Marcus and Ghost's story offers profound hope. At 62, Marcus thought his purpose had died with Catherine, that the best chapters of his life were behind him. How many of us have felt that same crushing weight, believing our most meaningful contributions were in the past? Yet, in his darkest moment, when grief had isolated him from the world, Marcus discovered that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens, transforms, and finds new expressions we never imagined possible. Ghost, a father who had lost everything, chose to trust again, to build a new family from the ashes of tragedy. Together, they proved that our later years aren't about winding down, but about the wisdom to recognize unexpected opportunities for connection, purpose, and even joy. The sanctuary they built became a legacy greater than either could have achieved alone, touching thousands of lives and changing how the world sees the bonds between species. Sometimes our greatest adventures, our most important work, our deepest love stories are still waiting to be written, even when we think the book is closing. Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose after a major loss? What moment in your life reminded you that it's never too late for new beginnings? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.